Step on up, Dad.
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Dan McKiernan, the Director at the Division of Marine Fisheries, and tonight we're hosting a public hearing with our Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission. And there are 3 members of our commission: Ray Kane, the chairman, Mike Peardenach, the vice chairman, and Khalil Bogdan on as well. We have other staff. We have Story Reed, Nicola Meserve, and Ben Gahagan as well. And thank you for attending. These hearings are somewhat of a formality, but let me get into some detail. When we have to file emergency regulations mostly because of time constraints, we have an informal public hearing in advance, which we did, I think, back in February to get input on the scup, sea bass, and fluke measures. We bring it to our commission. They approve, they by consensus give me kind of the blessing for a particular path forward, a particular suite of regulations. And now tonight and tomorrow is sort of the formal rulemaking process, but the input that we got on those particular measures was thorough and was discussed and debated by the commission. But tonight we have like 3 separate items. The first one is the final airing of those scup, sea bass, and fluke recreational measures. The second issue is recreational striped bass filleting, which I hope you among the attendees, I suspect is what we'll be focusing a lot of conversation on. And the last one is the recreational Gulf of Maine cod and haddock limits. That third one is separate, but it's us trying to come up with complementary rules with the New England Fishery Management Council / NOAA Fisheries. So thank you for attending. We do want your input, especially on those that we can maybe take a final action that's very slightly with the emergencies. We like to make these conversations and these events as meaningful as possible. So why don't we get into the first item? This is the recreational summer flounder rules. Go back to that timeline slide, if you would, Jared. So you can see here, we did enact regulations on the first 2 items, particularly the scup, sea bass, and fluke regs, and the striped bass filleting rule. Tonight, we're having this virtual public hearing, and then tomorrow we're going to meet with our commission and sort of finalize these. So your input will have value, it will be timely, and then the final rules would come out weeks later. The rules that were enacted as emergencies back on April 30th remain in effect for 90 days. So we have a little bit of time to make those permanent, but given the commission schedule, we want to dispense with these as soon as tomorrow, at least the first and second items. So let's get into the first conversation, which is about scup, sea bass, scup, and fluke. Nicola, I think, is going to take that. Nicola is the proxy for me on these particular boards at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And as part of that, she routinely attends the Mid-Atlantic Council meetings, where a lot of these species are so-called jointly managed. So Nicola, why don't you go into the specifics for these 3 species?
Okay, thank you, Dan. Try to keep it relatively brief here, but for each of these species, we had some interstate management requirements this year to take with our recreational measures. For both summer flounder and scup, there were mandatory reductions, and with black sea bass, it was a requirement for status quo regulations, except for some small seasonal adjustments could be made that weren't expected to increase harvest. So specifically for summer flounder, well, let me back up. For all of these species, the goal is to set regulations that are intended to achieve the recreational harvest target. So that's looked at a coast-wide basis. And then there are species by species rules as to how those reductions are achieved state by state or regionally. In the case of summer flounder, we were looking at a state-specific 28% reduction in harvest needing to be taken. We developed a suite of options that looked at combinations of season, bag, and size limit. And the comment that we received through our scoping meeting that we had in March was that the preference was to achieve the reduction through size limit adjustment as much as possible and maintain the higher bag limit. So we were able to get almost to that 28% reduction by going up 1 inch for the vessel-based fishing modes. The shore mode is such a small contributor to summer flounder harvest in Massachusetts that leaving it at 16.5 inches didn't make any difference in the projected harvest. So that 1 inch increased to 17.5 inches on the minimum size. And we just needed to tweak the season a little bit to get all the way to the 28% reduction so that the season was shortened by, about 9 days. For SCUP, we work as a region with Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York to try to maintain as compatible and consistent regulations within our region as possible. When we were looking at, as the region, as a 10% reduction in harvest to achieve an overall 10% coastwide reduction as well. And this could be achieved through a 1 inch or a 1/2 inch increase in the vessel-based modes. Again, thinking about the availability of fish shore generally being smaller, the decision was made to keep the shore based size limit at 9.5 inches and just take that 1/2 inch increase in the vessel, private vessel and for hire modes to achieve the 10% reduction. So as a region with each state going up 1/2 inch, we achieved that 10% reduction there. We did have other options that looked at a bag limit decrease, but that was not favored in the scoping hearings. It would have had to been a rather significant bag limit reduction to achieve a 10% cut because overall, not many people are keeping the 30 or 40 fish. And then with black sea bass, as I said, we only had a little bit of wiggle room to change the rules to adjust the season. And so we bumped up the opening to May 18th this past Saturday to maintain that Saturday start date in May, which required taking a couple of days off the end of the season so that our measures weren't projected to increase harvest. Lastly, I'll just note that for summer flounder and SCUP, these measures are expected to be in place for 2 years. We recently had a stock assessment that factored into the setting of these measures. Black sea bass, it's just 2024 that these rules are expected to be in place at a minimum. There's an assessment that's going to be completed this year, which will help to inform the setting of measures next year. Dan, do you want to stop and do comment in between or take all 3 issues?
I think so. Let's just
Okay.
see if there's any comments on this.
Okay.
So Jared, do you want to give advice as to how to raise?
Yeah, so there's a hand raise function. If you want to select the raise hand, that creates a queue. And I can call on you based on the queue. If you don't want to comment, you don't have to raise your hand and we'll just move on to the next item.
Can folks use the chat feature, Jared?
I think the chat feature is disabled.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any hands raised, so let's move on to the next item.
I think Joe.
I see one hand going up and
okay.
down, yeah.
Yeah.
Joe Peckner?
Yes. Thank you, Nicola and Dan, for your presentation here. I have some questions, and I want to start to say I have attended these meetings over the last several years. So some of what I take to be these regulations, I look at it historically in terms of where did we start, where are we now? So last year there was a spirited discussion, if you remember, Dan, around the option 4 that separated out the private vessel fishers and the for hire fishers. To your credit, you maintained parity throughout the species on that. So my first question here is, why are we seeing, I thought that spoke to the issues of fairness and the fact that there is a one category of recreational. And so if you can talk to that issue of
Yeah.
why are we seeing this distinction between the private fishers, true recreational, and the for hire.
Sure. I think the species that you might be focused on is scup.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, the scup rules deviated between for hire and private about 30 years ago. And they got something called the bonus season, which was something that the for hire vessel owners convinced the regulators at the time. And I think this is one species where that still lives on, not only here, but in some of the other states as well, where there seems to be this business model or this different clientele that wants to, fish, for large quantities, and it's accommodated with this differential limit. It's called the bonus season. It only lasts 2 months. And that's the differential you see there between 40 and 30. So I've kind of inherited this, but
Yeah.
it's really critical for that business model. As far as black sea bass and fluke goes, those rules are, I'm looking it over, are more consistent.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's just a remnant of a
Yeah.
management strategy that's three
Well,
decades old, and I don't want to poke that bear.
Yeah, well, again, for the record, here, it just, it flies in the face of the idea of a 10% harvest reduction. When in fact that reduction actually, by and large, is on the backs of the private, who are actually not making are nonprofit, or no, are just trying to put a few fish on the dinner table for their families. So again, for the record, I'd like that to be noted, and it certainly doesn't bode well to say that this goes back 30 years. I mean, we know more. Certainly, we know more, and I'm 79, so we know a whole lot more than we knew 30 years ago. All right, my second question is this, which has continued to puzzle me. And I'm going to make reference to the Kobe chart from the NOAA Smart Stocks, which has for the Mid-Atlantic region, the black bass biomass is above target, and the fishing rates are sustainable. Compared to the summer flounder, in which the biomass is too low. However, it's in that third quadrant, and the fishing rate is sustainable. Now, when you calculate the days, the seasonal days of fishing, we've got the black bass. I have calculated at 108 fishing days versus the fluke, which is 122. So it just seems out of sync with what the data is saying in terms of how do we manage, how do we manage this, and at the same, walk that fine line that you guys have to walk between, preserving this.
Yeah. Joe, let me
Yeah.
take a crack at that.
Okay.
So the first part of the answer has to do with the fact that there's a built into the management plan, which is approved by the Mid-Atlantic Council, which has commercial representatives on it and recreational fishing representatives and NGOs. Species like scup, sea bass, and fluke, they have targets for sharing, percentage targets. And I don't know, Nicole can help me what that is. It used to be 80-20 on scup, 80% commercial, 20 on rec. I think it was raised up to a higher percentage for the rec. But there are specific targets, and the recreational fishery is so successful that they often overshoot the target that's kind of like projected for the year. And so that's why the recreational fishery is forced to reduce sometimes even when the commercial fishery isn't even fulfilling all of its quota. So this is kind of a quirk of the federal management plan. As far as the number of days fishing, in the open season, Massachusetts doesn't have the same fishing opportunities that other states have with longer seasons. And that's, again, it's because our fishing is so successful, especially early in the season, like now when the fish show up to spawn.
Right.
Despite the low trip limits, a lot of people get to max out on those limits. And so our fishing is so good. And this again is another one of these legacy management strategies. When it started out that each state was kind of given a proportional share of the rec catch. And despite the fact that we've tried to convince the other states, listen, we need to break out of this because we think we deserve more fishing days. We haven't been successful yet, but we intend to keep fighting for that. Nicola, do you want to add any of your insights into the answer?
That covers most of it. I guess I would say that the Mid-Atlantic Council and Interstate Commission are trying to work on this problem of, the abundance and the regulations not always feeling like they're in sync. There's been some recent changes that when we look at how does the projected harvest compare to the harvest limit, we're also taking into consideration now the uncertainty around the harvest estimates. We're taking another look at what the biomass is and using that to kind of cap the level of change that has to occur. So in this case for scup, because the biomass was so high, instead of something like a 18 to 20% reduction, it was capped at a 10% reduction because of that high biomass. So there is an additional effort to take into consideration that the abundance of the species in setting the measures. But it's not perfect, and that's an ongoing process with another addendum or management plan in the works currently.
And the other thing I would add about flounder, the summer flounder fluke issue, is that we know from our own surveys that it appears that that some of the fish that should be catchable by our recreational sector don't seem to be present near shore. They seem to be shifting off to like the east Nantucket shoals. And I know, a lot of the charter captains have had some very successful trips heading east, whereas, the anglers in Buzzards Bay and Nantucket Sound haven't had the same success. And that may be a fish distribution issue, not necessarily a stock abundance issue.
Right. So I just want to add two other points. One, and I made this suggestion last year, but and you made a point of it now here today, Dan. But May 8th, when we look at the black sea bass and their cycles, we're in the prime of their spawning season, and what would make more sense, I think, again, in the interest of the conservation, is I'd rather see us have the same the seasonal dates as summer flounder. And if you want to back it up to the 108 days, but it doesn't make sense to be fishing in May for black sea bass in May, early June, when they're inshore in relatively shallow water, and you can catch your limit in 15 minutes. That's how abundant it is. But again, looking at the adjustment being made on the season as opposed to either the bag limit or the size. But May 24th through September, it'd be nice. And this was noted. I read through your scoping, some of the notes from the previous written testimony, but people did offer that to mid-September is a nice time to be able to catch sea bass as well.
Yeah, well, we appreciate those comments, and we try. And, 8 months from now, we'll be
Yeah.
going at it again, trying to,
Yeah.
look at, what the tally looks like. Although I guess Nickel, you mentioned earlier that it's unlikely we're gonna have any changes on scupper, summer flounder, but we might see a change next year on sea bass.
Possibly because there's a stock assessment and we're not in the same kind of 2-year cycle that we are
Yeah.
with summer flounder and scup. Yep.
So we're trying to keep these changes to a minimum, and I hear you on trying to line it up as best as we can, and I think all the staff agree with that. We try.
Yeah. Dan, I'm an activist, so, who do, we need to, particularly for the recreation, the for-hire guys have their, they actually have, saw the Stellwagen Bank charter group there, but like we need to become more active, as individuals, not outside of the division of marine fisheries. In some ways, you're sort of between a rock and a hard place. But who needs to hear this stuff? The policymakers, who's in charge?
Well, at the state level, it would be me with my 9-member commission, 3 of which are on the call. If you're interested in participating in something like a Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission, or someone else who is, you could always contact Commissioner Tom O'Shea and try to get or to apply for a seat. Our commission appointments are 3-year terms and subject to reappointment, and they often are, but sometimes we have openings, and we'd love to have somebody on there like yourself who's a private angler. It's a perspective that we don't always get. I mean, you're right. The for-hire sector is well represented because it's their living and they are super active, but it sounds like someone like you or some of your colleagues, would be interested in staying informed and maybe get involved with our commission.
Well,
And of
okay.
course, we have these meetings every month, so, you can stay in touch with us. Jared Silver, who's managing the meeting tonight, is like a first point of contact on a lot of our regulatory measures. And of course, Nicola is my proxy and right at the tip of the spear on so many of these key management issues.
I'll send you an email with my contact information. I would be interested in, I'm not trying to, I don't begrudge the for-hire,
No.
at all. But again, we're in this category of recreational, so we gotta play by the rules.
Understood.
Thank you.
Jared, any other hands up on this issue?
Not seeing any, Dan.
Okay, let's move on to striped bass. So,
Okay. Oh,
Nicola, introduce this topic
Sure.
and then we'll get people's input. So go ahead.
okay. All right. So we have some new interstate requirements relevant to recreational striped bass filleting that came into place through Addendum 2, which was just approved in January. It stated, this is the same addendum that put into place a commercial quota cut and maintained the 20 to 31-inch slot. And then a lesser part of that was a new filleting rule that says that any state that allows filleting in the recreational fishery needed to have some minimum requirements for that allowance, which included retention of the racks and possession of no more than 2 fillets per fish. These were meant to improve compliance and enforcement with the recreational limits. So given that May 1st implementation deadline, DMF went through emergency rulemaking for this issue to address our existing rule, which said that recreational fishers shall not mutilate any striped bass in a manner that prevents the accurate measurement of the fish. However, we do have one longstanding exception to that, which was for the captain and crew on the for-hire vessel to fillet striped bass for their customers, provided there's no more than 2 fillets in possession and the skin is left on the fillets. So the two problems with what we had kind of were first that our intended our interpretation has been that there's no at sea or shoreside filleting at sea aboard private vessels or shoreside, but it was unclear, when can you actually process a fish to eat it? And also the language as it was often misinterpreted as thinking that filleting could be done at sea aboard a private vessel as long as the rack was retained for that measurement. But that was not what we had intended when the rule went into place. Secondly, in order to have the for-hire allowance remain in place, we needed to adopt the rack retention bit of the ASMFC rule to keep that in place. That we knew was going to be a little bit contentious as to how that was adopted. So we did hold a scoping meeting in February with the for-hire operators to kind of discuss the implications and how we could implement that in mass in the kind of least burdensome way. So the emergency measures that we put into place continued that kind of distinction between private vessel and shore angler modes and the for-hire mode. And we sought to clarify that the intention of the rule was to keep fish whole while at sea or shoreside, including any adjacent land, structure, road, or parking lot. Although evisceration, bleeding, descaling, those types of things that don't change the measurement of the fish were allowed. And we did include an exemption in the emergency rule for processing of striped bass for immediate consumption, such as if you were on board your vessel staying overnight, wanted to fillet a fish and eat it, or at a campground, this shoreside, such as Salisbury Beach or something. The other part, so in essence, what this meant is that a private vessel angler or shore angler would need to have finished their fishing, gotten into their car in most cases and be driving away before filleting would be allowed. And that was meant to provide, the maximum amount of time for law enforcement to inspect fish for compliance. On the for-hire side, maintain the existing exemption to fillet fish for the patrons while at sea. And up until the time that the vessel is docked and just prior to the anglers leave the vessel. With that, and we also adopted a rack retention requirement that said that the racks had to be retained in a manner that doesn't interfere with their measurement or the species identification until the vessel is docked and the patrons have departed the vessel. With that rack retention requirement, and based on for-hire interest, we changed the requirement that the whole skin be left on the fillet for identification just to a 2 square inch patch, which is what we have in place in our groundfish rules that allows filleting. We have had a number of comments already about this rule when we send it out as an emergency measure. We did hear back primarily about that, clarification for private vessel and shore anglers, specifically concerned that, shoreside fillet stations, many of which are paid for with recreational license fees, would not be able to be used to fillet a striped bass. And that came along with a lot of concern about taking a whole fish home, filleting it there, and then how a rack is disposed of. Not everyone has easy, manageable access to dispose of racks once they get back to their house. So we are considering modifying the final rule from the emergency measure to authorize anglers to fillet striped bass shoreside after they're done with either vessel or shore-based fishing. And at that time where all of the fishing gear is stowed and they're not fishing anymore for the day, to allow a striped bass to be filleted. We also wanted to make sure that the language that we use would allow an angler to come back to the shoreline to dispose of a rack if they did choose to fillet it at home, which our initial emergency language, might not allow. So those are some additional considerations that we would really like to get feedback on tonight. There's been less comment thus far on the for hire regulations in the emergency measure, in part, I think, because we held that initial scoping meeting and because the rack retention piece is an interstate requirement that we can't not adopt at this point.
Thank you, Nicola. So as you can see, this is kind of a challenge for us to find ways to maximize compliance and enforcement while being reasonable and not discouraging people from fishing. If you have to take a 14-pound rack of fish and you're forced to take it home and your trash pickup isn't for another 6 days, it can be kind of challenging. And we just want to figure out a way that kind of meets a sweet spot in terms of and promoting compliance and at the same time not being excessively burdensome for anglers who are in compliance. So we'll take some comments on especially on what you just heard toward the end there about the potential to allow anglers to fillet, but only after fishing has ceased. So, folks, I suspect this is mainly why a lot of folks are participating tonight. So we'll take your comments. Any hands up, Jared? Yep. There you go.
Ed Kelly? Ed, you can unmute yourself. Ed, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself. It's the microphone icon. Yeah, I'm going to go to the next person in the queue. Andrew Kelly.
Andrew, are you related to Ed?
Andrew, you there? Andrew?
Hmm.
I'm going to see if I can't activate the chat.
So Andrew and Ed, we haven't been able to hear you.
Okay. The comments, the chat is open. So if anyone wants, if you could put your question in the chat, I can read it as well. Well, we try to get these two folks squared away. Does anyone else have a comment on this? All right, Dan, do you want to go to the next item while we try to square this away?
Yeah, so Andrew and Ed, it sounds like, or appears we wanted to comment on this. Is there a way that we could get your comments by phone? What do you think, Jared? Maybe they could call in. I could put on speaker. What do you think?
Sure.
Why don't we do that? Put it in the chat.
Yeah, I'll do that.
So Andrew and Ed, we're gonna give you a cell phone number that you can call in. I'll put it on speaker. Maybe you can communicate to the group in that fashion. Be low tech, but we'll figure it out. All right. Okay, stand by. Go ahead. Good. Jerry, can you hear? Is it Andrew? Okay, can everybody hear Andrew?
Nope.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I think so. As mentioned earlier, I think the allowing people to fillet shoreside is going to be a huge convenience factor for a lot of people, especially since pipe glasses are pretty popular fish to kind of get on vacations and that sort of thing. So people are coming by and they necessarily don't have a place to get back to fillet the fish and then deal with it afterwards.
So you'd be in favor of the language that we're proposing to, okay. Jerry, did you hear that?
No, Dan,
successfully?
could you summarize that comment? The
Yeah,
audio was
What
garbled
Ed
for me.
said was, there's a lot of anglers that he knows are on vacation. They don't necessarily have a place to go back to their domicile. And he is in favor of allowing this, to occur after fishing.
Sure. And Ed Kelly in the chat has written, I feel allowing filleting would be great. I like to see the fish cared for in the best possible manner. Being able to fillet and get them on ice quickly.
Okay,
All right, so those are the two hands raised we have on that.
all right, thank you. Mr. Kelly and Mr. Kelly, we appreciate that.
All right.
All right, we can go to the third item. If no one else wants to weigh in on this.
Not seeing any other hands on that.
Okay,
Okay, lastly is recreational Gulf of Maine cod and haddock. We are proposing regulations to align the state waters rules with the final federal rules. NOAA Fisheries has just recently announced the draft rules based on what the New England Council has recommended and can be seen in the table. This would increase the minimum size limit by 1 inch to 23 inches for Gulf of Maine cod. That would align the size limit with Georgia's bank cod. And for Gulf of Maine haddock, the proposal is to provide private anglers the same rules as for hire anglers had last year. So all anglers would be fishing under the same rules, which would be an 18-inch minimum size and 15 fish bag limit with the May 1 to February 28th open season, closed in March, and then open again in April. As usual, we try to align our rules with the federal rules as soon as they're available, because the fishery is typically mainly prosecuted in federal waters, and there's benefits to compliance and enforcement, data collection and analysis when the state and federal waters rules align. Happy to take any comment on these.
Joe Petner, you recognize you can unmute yourself?
Yeah, just again, a quick comment of appreciation for keeping for the strike through between distinguishing between for hires and private anglers. So again, I just think that's something that we all can we all should be able to support. So thank you.
thank you, Joe.
All right. I'm not seeing any other hands raised. If we want to bring it home.
Yeah, all right, so folks, thank you for your attendance tonight and for your comments. We're going to meet with our Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission tomorrow in a similarly virtual meeting. And try to take final action on some of these measures the way these emergency rules work is I can enact an emergency, for only 90 days. But in order to do a final rule that can live on, I need the approval of the Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission. I usually try to get that in advance, so I know that there'll be support for it after, but tomorrow is the after when we try to make it a permanent rule. So if anybody wants to listen in on that meeting, they're welcome to do so. That meeting starts at 9 o'clock. We'll be into this part of the business meeting probably by 9:30. But thank you very much for your participation and your input. We really do appreciate it. And I hope you all have a great fishing season. For a lot of species, it's just starting this week. Jared, we good?
Yes, we're good.
All right, so thank you, everyone.
Thank
We'll
you.
sign off.